Okay, so we've gotten through the first hour, and we'll just continue on here where we left off. So I'll do a little bit more on this image. In fact, I think quite a bit more, and then we have a couple more, several more images we'll work with later. Let me tweak my screen. Okay, and the angle I'm looking at on the laptop. So some other things I could do here. Yeah, I was going to go into Selective Color. I like using that a lot. Hold on. Let's compare it to Color Balance. Color Balance divides it by midtones, so you're tweaking the color ranges of all the midtones at once, then all the highlights, and then all the shadows. That usually works pretty well, you know, for generally tweaking the whole image as far as its color. But if you want to target specific colors, I would use Selective Color. So say I don't want to get all the mid-ranges, I just want to get the reds, I could tweak that here. Now you can kind of get all the neutrals down here if you want, but that really changes quite a bit. You can hardly, if you go and use that, you have to very slightly tweak that, but anyway, because it will drastically change the hue. Anyway, back to this. So I'm targeting red. I'm thinking I want to excuse me, make it a little more red, so I'm reducing the cyan actually in the red to achieve that. And maybe bump up the magenta just a tad. Let's see what reducing the yellow looks like or does. And bumping it up again. We'll just leave it at 0. 1 second, I better pause here since I'm about to cough. Okay, so let's say that I also want to tweak the greens a little bit. Maybe they look too yellow or too green or too blue or what have you. I'm just going to experiment and see. Okay, that makes it look a little less green. This makes it look a little more cyan or blue. Maybe I'll just bump it up slightly. Maybe I'll bring up the magenta as well, which kind of I might be ending up with something that looks pretty much the way I started out, though. Adjusting the yellow within the green doesn't seem to be doing very much, which is kind of unusual. Usually there's a lot of yellow and green and it changes it quite a bit, but okay, there is 0. Apparently, I'm thinking the greens here. Sometimes Photoshop doesn't view shades of green as green. It doesn't recognize them as green because it's not. If you zoom in enough, it's not actually green. Part of that is because we're working with RGB on the monitor and CMYK here for the slider here, but it's actually an RGB file, though. I'll mention a little more about that in a second. What I'm trying to say is that, if it were a true green, if I were tweaking and moving these around, you would see quite a bit of difference. But as it's kind of not a very true green, you hardly see any change because it's, well, you do see some, I guess. If you're going to see change on anything, you're going to see it in the black, the most change. So I usually test here to see, can I see any change at all? For instance, let's go to magenta. Usually there's not much magenta, surprisingly little in an image. So let's see, do I see any magenta shift here on the black anywhere in the picture? Excuse me. I don't seem to see any, so I'm not going to see it anywhere else here either. It's not going to show up at all. And this area here or here, just nothing. So that's kind of a little trick right there, just to test and see. if there's any of that particular hue to adjust, just go to the black and test it out. Okay, back to the green. So we bumped up the blackness of the green. I thought it looked maybe a little washed out. So let me just experiment again. So here is about 0, it's 4, and I'll bump it up to there. Not seeing much change from the mid-range at 0 to all the way up, really. I only see a difference when I bring it down. So let me try that one last time. 0, and then 97%. Yeah, pretty much no visual change. So let's preview here again, the whole thing changing. It's pretty much the same. I did tweak this to be redder. That's somewhat noticeable. I don't know if you can see the change on your screen as much, but hopefully you can. The recording might lose some of the color information. Whites, that's one thing that might be advantageous to tweak here. So if I want to make these clouds stand out even more, I don't know if I want to, but if I did, I could make the whites blacker, and there you have it. They stand out a lot more. So preview, there's before, there's after. That's a little too much. I might actually bump it up a little bit and use some of that. And again, it's just depending on what you're looking for in your image, if you want to do that or not. Looking at some of the other shades, do I want the snow or something to be bluer maybe, or more yellow? Maybe I'll bump up the yellow just very slightly. One other thing you have to keep in mind, what you're seeing on the screen here is not necessarily it's not going to translate necessarily that well to paper, because the screen out of necessity has to use RGB. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of that, but I'm just going over it for any who might not be. And in print, you have to use CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black toner, is usually toner. Toner in digital format printing, more like ink and an offset printing situation or machine. While I'm talking about that that frame of thought, let me just continue on that. So Rgb and Cmyk, they both have what's called a color gamut, and so the color gamut in Rgb is actually wider, so that means that you can reproduce a wider range of colors, whereas in Cmyk you're limited to a smaller range of colors. So that is where the problem is showing up. I mean, if you have all these bright colors on your screen and then you print it off, you're not going to get quite the color range because you're having to print on the more limited CMYK color range. RGB is also called an additive color gamut, whereas RGB is subtractive. And I guess I could get into why that is. Basically, you have to subtract out the colors. I mean, if you add all the colors together, you get white, which is, considered in color theory to be all the colors mixed together. You're using basically light, like white light in a prism. You separate them out to rainbow colors. So it's using light. That's why your monitor is using RGB. It's using light. Whereas mixing colors like on the painter's palette, the more you mix together, it doesn't make white. Obviously, it makes the exact opposite. It makes black. So that's where it's called subtractive, because black is considered the absence of all color. And that was obviously in tangent, but I wanted to fully explain what I was talking about here with we got off on RGB and CMYK. It's important to know what is on your screen is not going to translate to the paper necessarily very well. So my point is, the slider here, if you slide this way over, it's better to make little bitty movements if you can, and not get too carried away thinking in your mind, I'm going to make this look like a sunset. Let's put a lot of magenta and yellow in there, and then you print it off and it looks basically ridiculous, or it doesn't quite translate over that well. It might work for online usage, okay, but anyway, just be aware of that. I usually, sometimes I will tweak them, a little bit, certain way, if I want it to look a little more golden, as far as the sunlight or what have you, but often less is more, you might say, in this situation. Okay, so I did make it look a little bit warmer, maybe in my whites. Notice I bumped up the black, the yellow, magenta, and maybe I'll keep it that way. I don't know. It's again up to the individual. I think there's a little too much magenta. It's what you want. I want it at least to look fairly, realistic still. I do it. The sky is maybe a little too dark, I'm thinking, so let's bump that down. Anyway, I'll just leave it like that, I think. I could, let's try one other thing, cyan. Yeah, maybe I'll bump up the magenta a little bit, make the mountain range here a little bit darker. There's a lot of cyan in that. Maybe I'll bump up the cyan and the cyan there. What about yellow? The black, notice how it's kind of giving more contrast kind of effect down there because it's darkening the mountainside. So I'll bump that up a little bit. I don't want it to be too dark. We still want it to make it look like it's in the background. Obviously, maybe we're making it look a little less hazy. So there's before and after. Just subtle tweaks. Let's look at the blue. It will probably tweak the sky somewhat, or it might not. Let's go to the black and see if there's any blue in there at all. Not a whole lot. Little in the sky, little in the mountain, but it's more cyan apparently. Okay, well, I think that's enough tweaking for now. I usually end off with just seeing if I can do anything tweaking the neutrals a little bit. And maybe I like it being a little more cyan. We'll put 3% in there. And again, this is kind of subjective, just depending on what you're trying to make it look like. Kind of like that artist guy says, oh, I can't remember his name or what he says, so never mind. He says paint a little tree here, and whatever you want to do with the painting. In this case, whatever you want to do with the color, within reason. So, it's kind of interesting. I bumped up cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. I just put a little more of everything in there. Kind of had the effect of darkening it. So maybe I won't put any black in. Let's make that 0. No, let's put it up to 1. Alright, we'll just go with that. Click OK. And I could, again, save this as a preset. In this particular tool, you can excuse me, save Selective Color as a preset, or load a preset you've already saved in the past. Here's some I have right here. I was working with some lavender flowers, and then sky dirt, washed out desert. Way to fix the washing out. Alright, so back to this, click OK. Often in an image, the first thing I'll do is go right down the line and adjust the brightness, then the levels. I usually start with the levels actually, and then go to brightness, and then if I need to, exposure. If it's really off, I might go to exposure first. Let's look at the levels here. I think they look pretty good to begin with, but maybe I could, tweak them a little bit. They're pretty good. It's pretty good. I mean, it's just, again, fairly subjective. I don't want to blow this out, so I'm not going to tweak the light end really that much. If anything, I'll darken it. Well, I think it's pretty good. Let's see the before and after. So I have darkened it very slightly. I think that is an advantage. The sky is standing out a little, just that much, just that bit more. So we'll click OK. Brightness contrast, right up there under image again. Adjustments, well, actually not in adjustments, but maybe I want to reduce the brightness even more. I don't think I want to increase the contrast, mainly because it's going to be washing out the sky and making the darker areas even darker, and I don't really want that at this point in this photo. Well, if I reduce the brightness, you can see the clouds stand out that much more in the sky, but it gets to a point where you want this to be kind of brighter. Again, like I was saying earlier, you want some darks to lights for dramatic effect, and I think I'm getting to the point where I might be reducing my dramatic effect. So I'll just click cancel, and I think this is pretty good, and we'll save it as is. Oh, well, we could go over to hue, saturation, or vibrance. Let's go to vibrance for a minute. Vibrance is very similar to saturation. I could even reduce the saturation and bump up the vibrance, which is kind of weird, but I've done that sometimes. Kind of an interesting effect there. Some areas are brighter, and or we could bump up both of them, or reduce the vibrance, bump up the saturation. The vibrance seems to be more subtle of a color shift or color change, color saturation shift, bump, you might say. Excuse me. Then saturation itself. So I'm just going to set saturation at 0 and actually bring the vibrance up a little to an extent. Maybe I'll bump this up as well. It's looking a little bit unrealistic when I do that, so let's try. I'm kind of liking how this is standing out as kind of green when I use those settings, and I'm not losing a whole lot of the orange here, so that's good. Also, this is becoming more blue. Maybe I'll reduce it somewhat. So that's a very subtle color shift. In fact, let's bring it back up some. Click OK. So this is everything I might do on one photo, so it's kind of time consuming as you can see, but it all helps in the finished product. Okay, and then we'll finally save it I'll go ahead and save it as a TIFF, I guess. Here, we'll just save it to the desktop for now. In fact, no, I'll go ahead and save it in Photos for Class right there. Click Save. No compression in this case. There's other settings there you saw, but I usually just leave those as the default settings. Pause here for a moment. Oh, looks like it's done. Okay, well, 1 second. Alright, so we've covered quite a bit on contrast, level, sharpening, detail, exposure. Haven't covered stacking layers yet. We did remove chromatic aberrations. Haven't done lens distortion yet. In fact, well, we don't have to do lens distortion on this one, but I'll just show it to you. Say, for instance, well, maybe I'll show that later. Yeah, we'll save that for some other files I have in mind. Fine-tuning hue, we did that. And, okay, so let's continue on. So I save this as a TIFF file. Next, I would probably resize it and save it as a JPEG, and if I wanted to upload it to the internet. So image size, it was under image there, and it really depends on whatever size you want, but I have been mainly doing around 1200 or so. You have the option here of using Cmyk sharper, which often is best for reducing it in size if you want to make it sharper. But I found that I don't know, I just like using leaving it on the default here, best for smooth gradients, and then going into the filter up there and doing the smart sharpen instead. I've tried them in conjunction, both together. First I'll use Cmyk sharper, and then on top of that I'll add the smart sharpen, but it seems to be a little too much, and it seems the overall product at the end is a little bit rougher, a little bit over sharpened. So I'm thinking this was an older tool, and I'm thinking that the ability of the sharpening at that point wasn't as good, so I just do it all now with I've experimented with both and just use usually exclusively the smart sharpen. Okay, so I said all that to leave it on smooth gradients. You can again pick whatever you want. If you're enlarging even larger, you might pick this, but it was already pretty large. Usually don't enlarge photos that were already 46 megabytes. So anyway, you might though. Alright, so we'll leave it at 240. I could change to 72 DPI, and then it will shrink it there, but I'll just, well, it doesn't make a difference if I change it to 1400. Basically, your computer screen is going to be at 72 DPI, or dots per inch. In this case, I guess it's really PPI, which is pixels per inch. Some are, I believe, 100 and I can't remember, 108 or I don't know. I've experimented again with changing it to 72, and it basically it will make it look, it'll be the same size, whether it's 1400 pixels across or it's 1400 pixels, it's 1400 pixels. It will anyway, I think you kind of get what I'm talking about. I hope I'm not confusing too many people there. Alright, so now it is obviously smaller. Let's click on actual pixels. We'll view it. These four things I'll just mention pop up when you have this selected, the magnifying glass, and you can zoom in if you're holding it down. I believe you can do that on a PC as well. But anyway, let's view the actual pixels. So this is the actual size it's going to be on the internet. And pretty large for the internet, but probably don't want to make it much larger than that, if that large. Let's go ahead and filter, and if it's something you're going to sell, you might have it smaller. Most of the time people do. But anyway, filter, sharpen, smart sharpen. There were other sharpening tools which were from earlier versions. I don't use those as much anymore, but they're still there, and you can use those if you like. This is just how I'm doing it. So okay, let's select more accurate. And I usually just leave it on basic. You could click advanced, and then you have where you're targeting, certain areas, shadow, highlight. But I just, kind of do overall sharpening, usually. Okay, radius, I like to start off with the smallest and bump this up and see how that looks. Often it's, too much. And you might want to not do any sharpening at all, and that's fine, but I just, tend to like them fairly sharp as far as imagery. So that's too much, I'm thinking, so I'll knock that down. So I don't know, that looks pretty good to me just at first glance. Let me look at other parts of the photo here. I think it's okay. So 0.1 pixels at 145%, I'll click OK. You could also, if you have some other problems, say you had a motion blur you want to remove, you could remove that. Say you had an image that someone applied a Gaussian blur, which is one of the blur settings you can do in Photoshop, or you can get rid of that. But anyway, this is Gaussian blur is not something you'd have in a real life situation unless it was a manipulated photo. Okay, so we'll click OK with that. And then sometimes I like to go in a second time and overlay it with another smart sharpen, where I bump the radius up to, say, maybe 3 pixels, and then I might have it down here. So it's going to be a lot less fine of a sharpening. It might almost make it look more like I've increased the contrast. Yeah, it's not doing that much for it. More often I'll start with the rough one and then I'll finish it off with the one I did previously, you know, the 0.1 pixel sharpening. Okay, preview. Yeah, I don't see much difference. Let's try this one at 1 pixel and then bump it up to there. Yeah, that's too much. It's already very sharp, so I mean, I'm just showing you some images might require, you know, sharpening. If you have a fuzzier image, you might try one with that 3 pixel radius, maybe 18%, and then go around a second time with 0.1 pixels at, you know, way up here. But this image doesn't really require that. It looks pretty sharp to me. And I could, you can see before and after. You can see the preview here as well as here. Sometimes it will be slow loading one or the other, but yeah, so I'm just not going to do that. It's plenty right now. It might already be too sharp, but yeah, I think it's okay. So now let's say for web. Again, don't use save or save as, because we'll have issues with the sRgb and all of that. Right now it's in Adobe RGB. Oh, if you want to see what it's going to look like on the web, if you you know, convert it kind of to sRgb, you can go right here, proof setup, internet standard. There we go, sRgb. Click on that. Notice it's a lot more washed out. So that's what it's going to look like. You just save it, not save for web. It's not going to convert it very well. It's going to interpret it kind of like that. Okay, so we'll go File, Save for Web Devices. And for the internet, usually I keep the quality about midway, sometimes higher. It's 50 is fine. Sometimes in the 70 range, I will have it up there, but I don't know what it's doing. It's thinking about it. Come on. Oh, I know why. It's pretty large for the internet, so it's, yeah, having a cow, I guess, or I don't know. It's crunching on it. Notice I have clicked here, convert to sRgb, so it will hopefully do a better, you know, pretty good conversion. This is the preview. Also, over here, note that it, as a JPEG, it's going to only be 115 kilobytes, 115.2, and it's going to take someone 2 seconds to load on their screen if they're on a 1 megabyte per second internet connection. sorry, 1 megabytes per, yeah, per second. Boy, it's really taking its time. That's kind of unusually long. And it's kind of hung up there. I hope it snaps out of it here. Also optimizing it, that's check marked, embedding the color profile, but it is converting it to sRGB. That's important to embed the profile. Well, actually, I don't know how important it is because it would strip it on the internet. I just leave it like that, usually check marked. Okay, it's not snapping out of it. Well, let's pause here.